Welcome back to our Revelation Happens series, and this will be Revelation Concludes, video 4, and hopefully we can just wrap it up this time. So let's look at where we're at. We left off at the Ezekiel part, so we just kind of wrapped up that the two nations are connected two witnesses, the seed, the children, the posterity of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. So I've made those connections a few times, but Ezekiel keeps going with that idea. So I think it compares perfectly with Ezekiel 35 and 37, well, and more. I'm surprised there's no quote to Ezekiel from the New Testament. There's only cross-references, but if you read chapter 34 first, there's an end-time context where Christ returns. And if you notice what it all cross-references to, if you're studying that, which is what this is for, then Ezekiel 35 is referring to these people from chapter 34, which are God's chosen to the house of Israel. So Ezekiel 35:10 calls them two nations and two countries, being house of Israel and house of Judah, as we see in chapter 37. So it's all in context. But chapter 36 is also in the context of two countries who make up the 12 Christian tribes as Christian Israelites who follow God's law. Then in Ezekiel chapter 37, we see the dry bones of the whole house of Israel as a great army brought back to their land and given the Spirit of Christ. So I said that connects with the end of chapter 19 when Christ returns. He has this great army on white horses. They're 12 kindred tribes killed back in 11:7. So just connect the dots. And they're given the Spirit of Christ, which is the return of Christ ruling over the 12 tribes, which we have in chapter 20 of Revelation. So we have this two sticks prophecy. It's to the house of Israel, house of Judah. Connects us back to the Genesis chapter 48 prophecy with Joseph and Ephraim are being brought back together, sanctified under Christ, and their posterity will follow God forever. Same context. So they're called two nations, two kingdoms, but of course they're lamb kingdoms under the new covenant of peace equals the two witnesses for Christ from Genesis chapter 48 in prophecy as Christian Israel, described in Revelation 12:17 and 14:12, plus other verses as the blessed, holy, saints, conquerors, etc., as we've already seen. Those are all the same people. And there's more. I see Daniel chapter 7 is describing the events in Revelation from a war perspective. So the beast or empires, it says that they're at war, which coincides with Revelation 13:1, same beast. Satan is the power over this one world military government. That's a beast empire. 13:2, Revelation 13:7 links back to 11:7, is indicating this beast empire conquers the two witnesses in war. And up on there after a financial collapse, because that goes back to chapter 6 in Revelation. And it describes them as nations of holy people who speak different languages. So 13:12 gives the Lamb Kingdoms moniker. All of this ties back directly to Revelation chapter 12 as the children of Sarah, her crown of 12 stars from Genesis 37:9, plus others. They're like 35:11 and so forth. Who follow God's law, teach the message of Christ in Revelation 12:17, the kingdom message promised to Israel as the 12 kindred tribes from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's Hosea 1:9-10 and 2:23, which are both New Testament quotes that help us tie all this together. I haven't heard it taught this way before, but let's look at it. And 1:10 or 11, context is the children of Judah and children of Israel are living under Christ after the great day of God's harvest and wed to Christ forever under the new covenant. So you got the wedding feast at the end of chapter 19 in Revelation, and then you've got God's harvest also in Revelation. So After this primer on prophecy we've just been through, you now recognize the children of Judah and children of Israel as the two witnesses who follow God's laws, the 12 kindred tribes being redeemed in the end time. So the harvest is described in Revelation 14:14 through 20, where we see the sharp sickle reaping the harvest of the saints who rejected the mark of the beast versus the harvest of the wicked who accepted the mark of the beast. So there's a big argument over whether the wicked are Israelites in context who reject Christ or are mostly all non-Israelites. But reading Hosea beginning to end to cinch this argument once you realize these two verses in Hosea are quoted from Romans 9:25 and 1 Peter 2:10. You take into consideration your cross references are John 10:16, 11:49 to 52, Micah 2:1 through 3, 12, plus 5, 2 through 8, Hebrews 8:8, and Hebrews 10:16, which we've all read before. So we know 1 Peter 2:10 is about the royal priesthood and all those connections to Revelation, which we went through earlier. But the point that's being made about these two groups of people in Romans chapter 9 also quotes Hosea to clarify who Paul is referring to, and they're called Gentiles. Actually, Jews and Gentiles is the term in Revelation chapter 9. We'll go into those verses. And there's just no super condensed way of proving that Gentiles are the 12 kindred tribes in almost all uses of the term. There's 96 or 98 uses of the term Gentiles in the New Testament, and I've done a study on all of those. I've done an extensive video, and I posted the logical connections on my YouTube channel already. I've challenged all preachers or teachers to debate my teaching, and I'm still waiting for them to take me up on my offer. So my point on this Hosea quote in Romans chapter 9 is that these two groups Christ is talking about are formed in the womb, meaning both are Israelites. That's what I'm saying. So Paul mentions Jacob and Esau in Romans chapter 9, and Christ chose one over the other. He does mention that. But he also mentions where Christ hardened the heart of Pharaoh in 9:17. The one lump of clay in 9:21 then. So think about it. Does that include Pharaoh and anyone of any race in the one lump of clay? You see? Jacob and Esau came from the same race and family. That could be one lump. But one was chosen, one rejected. So that makes more sense. And many teach it as Israelites versus Edomites. But that's a superficial way to read it. It's not supported by the previous prophecies, which we've already read. The formed in the womb comment is mentioned many times in Isaiah. That's generally where we get it from. There's no indication there of non-Israelites being formed in the womb. As one group accepting Christ is chosen, the others being any one of any race who are the wicked, for example, who reject Christ. That's the way churches teach it, but that's not what you see in prophecy. No, it's one group of Israelites for Christ versus the other group of Israelites who revolt against Christ. It was like that way from Sinai all through the Scripture. It's the same thing over and over. It's mentioned as context from Exodus all through Scripture. There's a good list of other people who were cursed by Yahweh in Scripture, and specific reasons for this are mentioned if you go search out the history. There's 4 places in Psalms that list these groups, and they're on my chart. And I looked it up. It's Revelation Understood Chart 4. And if you pull up the top, that's where you'll see the groups. So I've listed all under Psalms, which is probably the best place to find it all. But we need to understand that the blessing and curses in Deuteronomy didn't and don't apply to just anyone. That context doesn't change throughout the Old Testament and doesn't change in the New. The Old Testament prophecies are quoted in the New Testament. It'd be a logical error to change who they apply to when you refer to them in the New Testament, which is what the church does. They might refer to the prophecy, but then they act like it can just apply to anyone when the specific context was Israelites. So it's probably a good way to convey this idea, but let's look at the quotes in Romans chapter 9, because I've been through it before in other videos, and I feel like I've absolutely proven my points on Gentiles, that they're the 12 kindred tribes. And then we can use this chart. Everybody should know the New Testament quotes in order. And that's just something good to look at. We don't need to pull that up, but you should have all these charts and just be able to glance at them at will. So I'm saying the two groups of people in Romans 9:21 to 23, it says one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor. So that's how they're being formed from one lump of clay. So they're both from the same lump. Right? That cross references to Isaiah 64:8. One are vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, the other are vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory. So this is the idea of predestination. Okay, we already know the ones who follow God's law will inherit mercy or blessings, and the ones who revolt will inherit curses or wrath. So this context follows through the entire Old Testament and only applies to the Israel people. So why change it now? Because 9:24 Romans then indicates God called Jews and Gentiles. These are both the entire group of 12 kindred tribes as House of Israel and House of Judah. As my video series on the subject clearly shows, I've done 3 different ones now. 2 specifically on Gentiles, and I covered it in another series after that. Then from Romans 9:26 to 33, we have 5 quotes which Paul refers to so he can clarify what he's talking about with his figure of speech and the 2 groups of people. See? But what's entirely overlooked by all scholars apparently is the 11 quotes to the Old Testament in Romans chapter 10, which is really just a continuation of the point that he's making in chapter 9. Doesn't change. So there's 11 more quotes on the same subject matter. My chart has a very simplistic paraphrase of the context of each quote, but it makes a good study chart, which is the one we just looked at above. New Testament quotes in order. So Romans 9:25 and 26 are quotes from Hosea 2:23 plus 1, 9, and 10, which we just covered above. And remember, Hosea 1:10 is also quoted from 1 Peter 2:10 about the royal priesthood, which includes Hosea 2:23 as well. Then Romans 9:27 quotes Isaiah 10:22 and Romans 9:29 to Isaiah 1:9, both about just a remnant of the 12 tribes being saved in the end time. By the fact that we teach about a remnant means that the majority of the 12 kindred tribes then are not saved or redeemed. If all of Israel are redeemed, then what's the term remnant referring to exactly? So, and Paul explains that with his next quote. Romans 9:33 quotes Isaiah 28:16 about Christ the stumbling stone and the rock of offense. Again, Christ the rock. He's also Christ the stumbling stones and stumbling block and a number of other things. So Romans 9:30-33 is where he makes the connection to these Israelites who revolted from Yahweh at Mount Sinai. That's where the idea starts in Scripture. All of Israel suffered 40 years in the desert because of a few of the leaders revolted who were identified as the heads of the tribes, usually called nobles or kings or whatever. But not all rejected Yahweh at Sinai. In fact, at that time, only a small number actually revolted. The problem is these nobles were the ones who were in charge. So to fix the problem in the future, Yahweh gave you a guideline to follow about electing godly leaders in Exodus chapter 18. This procedure was confirmed in Joshua if you just look at your cross-references. This is how America started out. Posterity failed to follow up on it. So we had the right idea. This comes from Scripture. But we quit doing it. So there's no doubt in Isaiah 28:16 that Christ the stumbling stone applies to the Israel people who reject Christ, not the world at large. Can't include others. It's only in the context of Israel. So Romans 9:24 plus 9:30 both use the word Gentiles, but then they quote verses that can only apply to the 12 tribes. So that's okay if you're teaching that the word Gentiles simply means nations, which is what it means, and in this use is referring to the nations of the 12 tribes, which is what the quotes indicate. But that's not what the universities are teaching to Christian pastors and teachers for their doctorates. They're not taught that way, even though that's the obvious context. So you can read Romans chapter 10, but 10:21 is the Israelites judged as tares because they reject Christ. So there's your context there in Romans chapter 10, the very next chapter. So other races, nations, or groups of people who are against Christian Israel may face the exact same judgment as tares, but they're not called tares that I can see. This tares idea goes way back in Scripture if we were to do a topical study on it, and the word chaff, etc. So maybe we could find an exception. I haven't done a topical all the way back to the beginning. But the two terms used in Romans chapter 9 are called Jews and Gentiles, with a remnant of that group, that is 12 tribes, separate into people who accept Christ and those who don't. That's the correct context, and we can follow it all the way back to Sinai if you want to follow my work, what I've done so far. One group is blessed, that is the remnant. The other is cursed, that's the tares. So both groups live together within the two Christian empires, which create a paradox. The wheat and tares are growing up together, exactly what the New Testament parable is about. The tares are committing treason against the wheat, if you want to think about it as a legal issue. And Revelation 9:21 lists the crimes the tares are committing against the wheat. It tells you. It's actually good that Revelation doesn't use the term Jew and Gentile in describing who it's addressing. Sorry, I had a sip of water. With all the specific mentions, though, of the 12 kindred tribes in chapter 7, we've connected the dots on that, and the 14, 15, and all the 12s in the last chapters. We already have the overall view, just going over it just lightly, you'd see all the 12s and all the connections to Israel. Then, as we just went through, how chapter 12 connects to chapter 11 and yet to Genesis chapter 48, which when we did that, showed it's in prophecy. Then there's prophecies in between, which we just went through, and how they all interconnect, same context, but they're all specific to Israelites, and let's make it specific to modern day Christian Israel. What do we see in Revelation that we can apply right now? You're just learning this. So if you think about it, we should read from the beginning. What's the first thing or event we should see and recognize in Revelation? In other words, it looks like what it would be is what's described in Revelation 1:7. Every eye shall see him, speaking of Christ. All kindreds shall wail. So all the kindreds of the 12 tribes should wail when they see Christ. In other words, that's the context. But it looks like that event would connect with the statements in 11:11 through 13. So I've taught this as the seals in Revelation chapter 6 being a preview of the actual events, most called trumpet judgments. So that's 8:7, 8:8, 8:10, 8:12, 9:1 is the fifth, 9:13 is the sixth, and 11:15 is the seventh trumpet. But the defined judgments are actually the 7 bowls of God's wrath in chapter 16, and chapter 17, 18 describe who is being judged for the murder of the saints. So judgment, looks like, is really on the people murdering the saints, even though the Israelites are judged. So my view of what we'd see first is really the event in 8:7, and I've described this in other videos as a false flag nuclear event because no star fell. So if it was a nuclear bomb of some type, it was already in its silo or already planted, let's just put it that way. It was already where it was blew up. In other words, it was already there. Didn't come in as a missile. So I think if most Christian people understood 1823 correctly, and the 4 uses of sorcery or sorceries in Revelation, though, a light bulb will go off in their head about right now. The whole world being deceived by sorcery isn't very specific until you look the word up. It's Greek, 5331 332 333. I have a section on it here. If you scroll down, I have another page. I used to have a whole website called I Blame the Pastors, and I just condensed it and put it on my page here. You can pull it up, but I pulled up the off of that page about pharmaceuticals and what these words mean that's used in Revelation. So the words are pharmakia, medication, pharmacy, magic, you see. I'm not going to try to pronounce all this stuff, but it's about a druggist, a pharmacist, poisoner, magician, and so forth. From Webster's 1828 dictionary, pharmaceutic, so pharmaceutic, and then pharmaceutical, it says, Greek to practice, it's Greek to practice witchcraft or use medicine, poison, or medicine pertaining to the knowledge or art of pharmacy or to the art of preparing medicines. So that's from Webster. So I think there's a apparent lie involving pharmaceutical drugs going on in 2020 as affecting literally the whole world. We've seen it play out on TV. And the Christian Israel people recognize they're being lied to. I think most people do. They probably already understand how it's possible to connect these lies, how the mark of the beast could be forced on them, as well as a final consequence of how things are playing out, in other words. Give me another drink. So I think it should make perfect sense to connect these 4 verses in Revelation to the people who were telling the lies and who will attempt to force the mark of the beast on everyone, because this is a worldwide event. I know we don't get it on TV that way all that much, but it is going on pretty much worldwide. So 4 verses of Revelation 9:21. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. And in 18:23 it was, and the light of a candle shall no more shine at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee, for thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. Well, it's interesting because the bridegroom, of course, is all in the context and the bride of Israel people, in other words. So apparently it's talking about a nation or a empire of all these Israel people who were merchants, the great men of the earth, and then they were involved in sorceries, deceiving all the other nations. That's actually the way Revelation 18 describes it if you read 17 and 18. And Revelation 21:8 says, but the fearful, unbelieving, and the abominable, and murderers, and whoremongers, and sorcerers, and idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. I need some more. And Revelation 22:15, for without are dogs, and sorcerers, and whoremongers, and murderers, and idolaters, and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie. Yes, well, that's what TVs are registered for. Entertainment channels are registered so they can say anything they want. Basically, everybody understands it's entertainment. So what I think everyone misses here is not just talking about a few really bad and sinful people. It's referring to industries that are allowed to operate or are sustained by the beast government or governments. How do we best make that connection? So we're going to look at the conclusions of Revelation, work backwards. So from 18 through 21, we had the last description of war, because the Gog-Magog war in 28:9 doesn't involve an actual battle, and no saints are murdered. So that's not a war. No one died except the people who were attacking. So that's the way it's described. Unlike 18:24, where Babylon is charged with the blood of the prophets and of the saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. And these are the people just above, who we said appeared to be Israelite people, merchants, and so forth, because of the way it used the terms. That is actually the way I teach it. Part of the two witnesses, in other words. So, this industry then is perpetual war, maintained by lies. That's your entertainment news. Funded by a global banking cabal. Those are the thefts. I think, well, we might not have a Federal Reserve in England necessarily or the UK, but they have central banking just the same. So, whatever they call it. And the banks then maintain the funding for the military industrial cabal, which commit murder through war. So, a topical study on fornication now will reveal it has three aspects playing out there, and that plays in. It's not just sexual, as people might assume. That's what fits the word whoremongers, but there's a spiritual fornication, which manifests as the false prophets mentioned. So, my I Blame the Pastors page we're on covers a few things I've detailed about that aspect. There are a lot of pastors just teaching the what you would call the Zionist Israel message to maintain their job because they're not teaching any of the scripture we're covering. If they openly agree with most of the things in this document and taught this logic, they'd be relieved of their position and job because for many that's all it is, a job with a salary. Otherwise, why spend the money to get a doctorate? So, the third definition points to fornication for gain. So, monetary, personal, whatever. You maintain your position or you're most likely promoted for your treason these days. That's what we see in a lot of things that happen in the government, and they're get a raise in pay when you could have done the right thing and exposed whatever crime was going on, spoke out against it. That's what I'm saying. You could have done it that way, and you might have lost your job, but at least you'd have your dignity. So, twice it mentioned the idolaters and whosoever loveth and make a lie concept. The sorcery scam that's being broadcast around the world fits this perfectly. It's hard to comprehend that people believe entertainment news reports anything truthful when they're all registered for by the ACC. FCC is providing entertainment. So they're registered that way and say anything they want. You can't sue them for lying because they're licensed to provide fantasies to people 24/7. Like Western movies, they're not truthful. I know, just put some stupid stuff on here. Andy Griffith, Star Trek, any show people watch. They're Hollywood fantasies. People can sit and watch 24 hours a day. Just pick a channel. It's entertainment. Now, when they switch to another fantasy, commonly called the nightly news, by what logic would anyone think that now they have to start telling the truth, or maybe they'll get sued? Why would you think that? They're not registered for telling the truth. They provide fantasies. There's a disclaimer on their website telling you it's all make believe. They give you full disclosure that everything you see on their channel is for entertainment purposes only. Yeah, sorry, I had to cough. If they tell the truth, it's by accident. News is scripted by the CIA, provided to all these channels to mass brainwash the whole earth. Before that, it was radio or print media or whatever. They're doing a lot of the same stuff. But the payback is that you can commit all these other crimes and rarely suffer a loss or even a challenge to your crime because you control the TV. And that's what allows the USA military complex to operate worldwide, not just ours, but others. We fight whatever war declared on the fake entertainment news media when Congress doesn't actually declare the war anymore. The cost for the war is trillions of dollars in debt for the citizens. And I don't know what to say when you have to explain to someone why that's unlawful. Government's creating a debt with your name on the bill to pay, and that's after they took every penny they could squeeze out of you in taxes every year. So there's so many things wrong with just these four industries mentioned in 921 that you can write books on the subject, and the books probably already exist. The point is, Christ is coming back to separate the saints, or the holy, or the chosen, whatever term you like, from the ones running the evil, participating in it for profit, or maybe they just look the other way. Who knows? They go along to get along and make their money. They know there's nothing they can do about it, or that's the way they feel. The saints or chosen are staying here on earth, being ruled by Christ. The evil are being destroyed and burnt as fuel for the sun. Remember, the angel had its foot in the sun. So, Christian people just don't fit within their plans. They're killing off the holy people piece by piece and by various means and methods if Jehovah allows it. I'm in a coughing fit. Once you've secured a really good job and have a family to provide for and so forth, you really take a lot of heat if you try to upset the apple cart and become even a whistleblower, for example. The mark of the beast is a line you can't cross, though. But sorcery runs the whole deception somehow. You don't know what's in those drugs you're taking. Only a remnant today takes no pharmaceutical drugs at all, including vaccines. So, it doesn't sound like a good idea. Revelation describes a war between God's chosen and a ruling class who are specifically against Christ. Apparently, they think they can win a war against them, or they want people to think they can. It sounds kind of psychopathic from our perspective, but don't get on the wrong side of this argument. Help is chosen if you can, but my advice is don't help anyone who's against them, no matter what. The mark they intend to give you identifies you. That's what it doesn't identify some other person that's against you. It identifies you. So that's how you're able to buy, sell, or trade is if you have the mark. And it's their ultimate source of control over you. So plan ahead. If you accept it, Jehovah told you what to do in these days. I teach it. Just happens to be 2017 to 2024, and by my estimation, the signs of the times should actually show that. I mean, there are a lot of people coming around now. They're saying that, but 5 years ago, they were laughing at me for teaching. Now they're teaching, but they're not teaching its connection to Revelation. So, we can expect more lies on TV until the mark of the beast is offered to everyone. Initially, it will be a choice, most likely, but not for certain people. For example, the fire, police, hospital, EMS, or people who work for the government, active military, for sure, will be mandatory. Then it'll trickle down. Commercial businesses, you know the rest of the story. Once you shot up 70% of the population, they're still alive. Most of the rest will follow in line. So there got to be some delay before it kills you. So really the last 10% of the people that pose any problem at all, that's where I expect Christ to step in and act in some noticeable way. I don't have anything to add here necessarily in my previous videos on the dragon, beast, and false prophet, or some say Antichrist. It doesn't matter. They're all Satan or under his influence and will do his will. The beast is simply a government that conquers other nations by superior military force and appeals to Satan for his help and direction. There are multiple beasts, as we see in Daniel chapter 7, who fall into the control of Satan. I spent a lot of time explaining the number of the beasts, which I think is simplified in Daniel chapter 7 once you compare what it says there to Revelation. So, I'd say false prophets are pastors or teachers along with the schools that teach the Bible as applying to anyone who deliberately does not teach the kingdom message as Christ taught it. Christ came to Jerusalem according to Old Testament prophecy. He came for the benefit of Christian Israelites, and those Israelites that rejected him, he rejected. Okay, but That's blessing and curses. No change from what he told Moses. Revelation is still talking about Old Testament prophecy to Christian Israel versus those who are specifically murdering them. Their parents were doing the same thing. Read Stephen's defense in Acts chapter 7. He said this and he was speaking to Israelites undeniable. Just read Acts chapter 7. Connect the dots on what he's saying. He cannot be describing anyone but Israelites. So, Revelation is speaking specifically to Christian Israel as the 12 kindred tribes from the Old Testament and New Testament. Some more water. So, if you really can't figure out the correct context, then you shouldn't accept the responsibility of being a pastor or teacher. It's assumed you studied how to determine proper context if you obtained a degree. Anyone who reads this document can understand the connections I show within. That's why I challenge the pastors and teachers who are deliberately misleading Christian Israel. Their message has been the leading cause for the destruction of America and the world at large. Because if they were using their doctorate to teach this properly, most people would understand it right off. So, I pray for the things promised to Abraham, the shield, the stone, the scepter. Then for fulfillment of all the prophecies for Christian Israel as the posterity of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I pray for Yahweh to give me a truthful message and put it together the best I can, which is what I'm trying to do. So I could use someone as a good editor, but I don't have that. The compiled information I do have should be more than enough for any of Christian Israel to get a good handle on the kingdom message and from the idea of how Christ actually taught it. Even enough information here to teach it to your kindred. So that's what you should be found doing when Christ returns. I think that's the end of the story. So I appreciate you watching. There's your references that I was talking about. I blame the pastors, and maybe you'll just be able to click on these. If not, I'd put this on here so you could copy and paste. So if you had to, you can copy and paste. And then I may have a few more by the time it gets on the web. So I'm just kind of running out of things. I could obviously I've spent a lot more time on Revelation in previous videos. A lot of time on the beast, trying to figure out the numbering of the beast and explaining. And obviously there's a lot of questions, but my topical cross-reference chart. I mean, once you look over how all these words connect the dots together, you can compare that to Revelation. It's the same thing. You compare it to the New Testament. It's the same thing. There's no change of context. The Gentile just means nations. The context was the nations of 12 tribes because it quotes prophecies from the Old Testament. Simple enough. So they're just pastors and people are just being brought off into teaching other doctrines, or they create ones, and it would be simple enough to stick with what I've got here and realize that it's the same people. Two groups all the way through from outside. It never changes. Pastors change. All right. Thanks for watching. It's probably one of the last videos I did. So share it with your friends.